All right, here we are, part 2 of the ultimate TOEFL listening practice. You've probably seen part 1 already, so you know that there are some differences between this practice and the TOEFL IBT. So let me just talk about a couple of the differences right now. The first thing is that you want to download the PDF in the description below because that will have answer explanations. We're going to show you the answers for each question, but if you want more of an explanation, make sure you download the PDF to see that. Also, a couple people asked if this level is the same as the TOEFL, and it is modeled based on the TOEFL. We think it is pretty much the same as the TOEFL IBT. On TOEFL test day, it'll look something like this, where you have the listening will look something like this, where you have a difficult vocabulary word while you're listening. And we do the same thing here for our short passages. You have some vocabulary that's difficult, and you can see it while you're listening. After the passage, the questions come up. You don't see the questions until after the passage finishes. It's the same for us as well. The only difference is that we have 2 questions per passage, whereas the TOEFL IBT will have 5 or 6 questions per passage. So the passages are shorter, they're about 1 to 3 minutes long. There you only get 30 seconds per question. On the TOEFL IBT, you control the time. If you want to go next, you go next. You want to go back, you can go, you can't go back for the listening, but you can control if you want to take only 5 seconds or a minute, it's up to you. But here, each question is 30 seconds. The questions appear after the passage, just like on the TOEFL IBT. Make sure you download the PDF in the description below for the answer explanations. And also you can take notes while you listen, just like the TOEFL IBT. You can have a pencil and a piece of paper on your desk and take some notes while you're listening to help you answer the questions. There's a bunch of different topics here. These are all the different academic topics we've included. These are similar to the TOEFL IBT. Some of them are not so common. For example, chemistry and physics is not so common on the TOEFL IBT, but we wanted to give a large range of topics, so that's why they're there. And there are 8 different question types. We mix them up, but the most common that you'll see are detail questions and probably these GIST questions as well. If you want to know more about the question types, I'll put a link in the description to another video on YouTube that we made about TOEFL listening question types. But that's it. Last 50 questions. Good luck, guys. And if you stick around to the end, I will be there clapping. Okay. All right. I'll see you there.
Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a biology class. Scientists use the term bioenergetics to describe the concept of energy flow through living systems, such as cells. Cellular processes, such as the building and breaking down of complex molecules, occur through stepwise chemical reactions. Some of these chemical reactions are spontaneous and release energy, whereas others require energy to proceed. Just as living things must continually consume food to replenish their energy supplies, cells must continually produce more energy to replenish that which is used by the energy-requiring chemical reactions that constantly take place. Together, all of the chemical reactions that take place inside cells, including those that consume or generate energy, are referred to as the cell's metabolism. Question: what is the professor mainly discussing? Two. What is referred to as the cell's metabolism? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a biology class. Now, as organisms adapted to life on land, they had to contend with several challenges in the terrestrial environment. Water has been described as the stuff of life. The cell's interior is a watery soup. In this medium, most small molecules dissolve, and the majority of the chemical reactions of metabolism take place. Drying out is a constant danger for an organism exposed to air. Even when parts of a plant are close to a source of water, the aerial structures are likely to dry out. Water also provides buoyancy to organisms. On land, plants need to develop structural support in a medium that does not give the same lift as water. The organism is also subject to radiation because air does not filter out ultraviolet rays of sunlight. Additionally, the male gametes, the male cell that is able to unite with the opposite sex in sexual reproduction, must reach the female gametes using new strategies, because swimming is no longer possible. The successful land plants developed strategies to deal with all of these challenges. Not all adaptations appeared at once. Some species never moved very far from the aquatic environment, whereas others went on to conquer the driest environments on Earth. Question: what does the professor imply about supporting plant life on land? Why does the professor say this? Water has been described as the stuff of life. Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a biology class. The goal of homeostasis is the maintenance of equilibrium around a specific value of some aspect of the body or its cells called a set point. While there are normal fluctuations from the set point, the body's systems will usually attempt to go back to this point. A change in the internal or external environment is called a stimulus and is detected by a receptor. The response of the system is to adjust the activities of the system so the value moves back toward the set point. For instance, if the body becomes too warm, adjustments are made to cool the animal. If glucose levels in the blood rise after a meal, adjustments are made to lower them and to get the nutrient into tissues that need it. Now, when a change occurs in an animal's environment, an adjustment must be made so that the internal environment of the body and cells remains stable. The receptor that senses the change in the environment is part of a feedback mechanism. The stimulus, temperature, glucose, or calcium levels, is detected by the receptor. The receptor sends information to a control center, often the brain, which relays appropriate signals to an organ that is able to cause an appropriate change, either up or down, depending on the information the sensor was sending. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? Why does the professor mention glucose levels in the blood? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a biology class. Community dynamics are the changes in community structure and composition over time, often following environmental disturbances such as volcanoes, earthquakes, storms, fires, and climate change. Communities with a relatively constant number of species are said to be at equilibrium. The equilibrium between species identities and relationships changes over time, but maintains a relatively constant number. Following a disturbance, the community may or may not return to the equilibrium state. Succession describes the sequential appearance and disappearance of species in a community over time after a severe disturbance. In primary succession, newly exposed or newly formed rock is colonized by living organisms. In secondary succession, a part of an ecosystem is disturbed and remnants of the previous community remain. In both cases, there is a sequential change in species until a more or less permanent community develops. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? Based on the information from the listening, indicate which characteristic on the left belongs to either primary succession or secondary succession. Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a biology class. Adaptive immunity is defined by two important characteristics: specificity and memory. Specificity refers to the adaptive immune system's ability to target specific pathogens, and memory refers to its ability to quickly respond to pathogens to which it has previously been exposed. For example, when an individual recovers from chickenpox, the body develops a memory of the infection that will specifically protect it from the virus if it is exposed to it again later. Specificity and memory are achieved by essentially programming certain cells involved in the immune system to respond rapidly to subsequent exposures of the pathogen. This programming occurs as a result of the first exposure to a pathogen, which triggers a primary response. Later exposures result in a secondary response that is faster and stronger as a result of the body's memory of the first exposure. This secondary response, however, is specific to the pathogen in question. For example, exposure to one virus, like chickenpox, will not provide protection against other viral diseases. Question: why is a secondary response faster and stronger than a primary response? Why does the professor say this? For example, exposure to one virus, like chickenpox, will not provide protection against other viral diseases. Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in an economics class. The story of modern economic growth can be told by looking at calorie consumption over time. The dramatic rise in incomes allowed the average person to eat better and consume more calories. So, how did these incomes increase? Well, the period of modern economic growth came about because of the way in which technological progress combined with physical and human capital rapidly expanded. Although distribution of income is still an issue, it is clear that the average worker can afford more calories in 2014 than in 1875. Now, aside from increases in income, there is another reason why the average person can afford more food. Modern agriculture has allowed many countries to produce more food than they need. Despite having more than enough food, however, many governments and agencies have not solved the food distribution problem. In fact, food shortages, famine, or general food insecurity are caused more often by the failure of government macroeconomic policy, according to the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen. Sen has conducted extensive research into the issues of inequality, poverty, and the role of government in improving standards of living. Macroeconomic policies that strive toward stable inflation, full employment, education of women, and preservation of property rights are more likely to eliminate starvation and provide for a more even distribution of food. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? According to the lecture, what would create a better distribution of food? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in an economics class. Unemployment can be a terrible life experience, like a serious automobile accident or a messy divorce, whose consequences can be fully understood only by someone who has gone through it. For unemployed individuals and their families, there is the day-to-day financial stress of not knowing where the next paycheck is coming from. There are painful adjustments, like watching your savings account decrease, selling a car and buying a cheaper one, or moving to a less expensive place to live. Even when the unemployed person finds a new job, it may pay less than the previous one. For many people, their job is an important part of their self-worth. When unemployment separates people from the workforce, it can affect family relationships as well as mental and physical health. The human costs of unemployment alone would justify making a low level of employment an important public policy priority. But unemployment also includes economic costs to the broader society. When millions of unemployed but willing workers cannot find jobs, an economic resource is going unused. An economy with high unemployment is like a company operating with a functional but unused factory. The opportunity cost of unemployment is the output that could have been produced by the unemployed workers. Question: what is the professor's opinion of unemployment? What is implied when the professor says this? The human costs of unemployment alone would justify making a low level of employment an important public policy priority. Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in an economics class. The natural rate of unemployment is not natural in the sense that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. It is not a physical and unchanging law of nature. Instead, it is only the natural rate because it is the unemployment rate that would result from the combination of economic, social, and political factors that exist at a given time, assuming the economy was neither booming nor in recession. Now, these forces include the usual pattern of companies expanding their workforce as they would in a booming economy or contracting it as they would during a recession. Also, keep in mind the social and economic forces that affect the labor market, or the public policies that affect either the eagerness of people to work or the willingness of businesses to hire. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? What would most likely happen to unemployment during a recession? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in an economics class. Perhaps no economy around the world is better known for its trade surpluses than Japan. Since 1990, the size of these surpluses has often been near $100 billion per year. When Japan's economy was growing vigorously in the 1960s and the 1970s, its large trade surpluses were often described, especially by non-economists, as either a cause or a result of its economic health. But from a standpoint of economic growth, Japan's economy has been in and out of recession since 1990, with real gross domestic product growth averaging only about 1% per year. and an unemployment rate that has been creeping higher. Clearly, a trade surplus is no guarantee of economic good health. Instead, Japan's trade surplus reflects that Japan has a very high rate of domestic savings, more than the Japan economy can invest in domestically, and so the extra funds are invested abroad. Now, in Japan's slow economy, the growth of consumption is relatively low, which also means that consumption of imports is relatively low. Thus, Japan's exports continually exceed its imports, leaving the trade surplus continually high. Question: why are Japan's large trade surpluses not representative of its economy? Why does the professor say this? Perhaps no economy around the world is better known for its trade surpluses than Japan. Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in an economics class. Now, the balance of trade, or trade balance, is any gap between a nation's value of its exports, or what its producers sell abroad, and its total dollar value of imports, or the foreign-made products and services that households and businesses purchase. If exports exceed imports, the economy is said to have a trade surplus. If imports exceed exports, the economy is said to have a trade deficit. If exports and imports are equal, then trade is balanced. But what happens when trade is out of balance and large trade surpluses or deficits exist? So, Germany, for example, has had substantial trade surpluses in recent decades, in which exports have greatly exceeded imports. Germany ran a trade surplus of $260 billion. In contrast, the U.S. economy in recent decades has experienced large trade deficits, in which imports have considerably exceeded exports. In 2014, for example, U.S. imports exceeded exports by $539 billion. Now, a series of financial crises triggered by unbalanced trade can lead economies into deep recessions. These crises begin with large trade deficits. At some point, foreign investors become pessimistic about the economy and move their money to other countries. The economy then drops into deep recession. This happened to Mexico in 1995. A number of countries in East Asia, Thailand, South Korea, Malaysia, and Indonesia came down with the same economic illness in 1997, which was referred to as the Asian financial crisis. Question: why does the professor mention the Asian financial crisis? What is the example the professor uses when discussing Germany?
Look, I know you guys want to do something else besides study for the TOEFL. You want to get your score as quickly and as easily as possible. So check out tscprep.com. We have everything to help you do that. For example, we designed the TOEFL emergency course, which is specifically for students who want to study in just a few days. There's just 5 hours of lectures and a bunch of practice as well, so you can prepare very quickly. But we also have something called the Score Builder program, which is for students who need more time to build their score. And the nice thing about having one of these programs, or even having classes or whatever you want for TOEFL, is that everything is done for you. So when I log in and I get my course or whatever I get my practice tests here. I have activities that I can do every day here. I have practice questions here that I can easily access, and my courses are right here as well. So everything is set up for you. So if you want to finish your TOEFL as fast as possible, check out tscprep.com. We have everything you need.
Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a U.S. history class. Mesoamerica is the geographic area stretching from north of Panama up to the desert of central Mexico. Although marked by great diversity, this region cradled a number of civilizations with similar characteristics. Mesoamericans were polytheistic, which means they worshipped several gods, and these gods possessed both male and female traits and demanded blood sacrifices of enemies taken in battle or ritual bloodletting. Corn, or maize, domesticated by 5000 BCE, formed the basis of their diet. They developed a mathematical system, built huge edifices, and devised a calendar that accurately predicted eclipses and solstices, and that priest astronomers used to direct the planting and harvesting of crops. We are able to learn so much about these people because they created the only known written language in the Western Hemisphere. Researchers have made much progress in interpreting the inscriptions on their temples and pyramids. Though the area had no overarching political structure, trade over long distances helped diffuse the culture. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? What does the professor imply about Mesoamericans? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a U.S. history class. Thomas Edison patented the light bulb in 1879. This development quickly became common in homes as well as factories, transforming how even lower and middle-class Americans lived. Although slow to arrive in rural areas of the country, electric power became readily available in cities when the first commercial power plants began to open in 1882. When Nikola Tesla developed the alternating current system for the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, power supplies for lights and other factory equipment could extend for miles from the power source. Alternating current power transformed the use of electricity, allowing urban centers to physically cover greater areas. In the factories, electric lights permitted operations to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This increase in production required additional workers, and this demand brought more people to cities. Gradually, cities began to illuminate the streets with electric lamps to allow the city to remain alight throughout the night. No longer did the pace of life and economic activity slow substantially at sunset, the way it had in smaller towns. The cities, following the factories that drew people there, stayed open all night. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? Why did electricity help bring more people to cities? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a U.S. history class. The Progressive Era was a time of wide-ranging causes and varied movements, where activists and reformers from diverse backgrounds and with very different agendas pursued their goals of a better America. These reformers were reacting to the challenges that faced the country at the end of the 19th century: rapid urban growth, immigration, corruption, industrial working conditions, the growth of large corporations, women's rights, and surging anti-Black violence in the South. Investigative journalists of the day uncovered social inequality and encouraged Americans to take action. While different causes shared some underlying elements, each movement largely focused on its own goals, be it the right of women to vote, the removal of alcohol from communities, or the desire for a more democratic voting process. Over time, some progressive campaigns proved more successful than others. Question: what is the professor mainly discussing? Why does the professor mention investigative journalists? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a U.S. history class. In the last decades of the 19th century, after the Civil War, the United States changed from a country that wanted to stay isolated from the rest of the world to one that wanted to expand American influence. The nation's earlier isolationism originated from the deep scars left by the Civil War and its need to recover both economically and mentally from that event. But as the Industrial Revolution changed the way the country worked and the American West reached its farthest point, American attitudes towards foreign expansion shifted. Businesses were looking for new markets to export their factory-built goods, oil, and tobacco products, as well as generous trade agreements to secure access to raw materials. Early social reformers saw opportunities to spread Christianity and the benefits of American life to those in less developed nations. the country moved quickly to ready itself for the creation of an American empire. Question: why does the professor mention the Civil War? What is the professor's attitude towards the expansion of American influence? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a U.S. history class. On the eve of World War I, the U.S. government under President Woodrow Wilson opposed any involvement in international military conflicts. But as the war continued in Europe, and as some of the powers in the war began to target commerce and travel across the Atlantic Ocean, it became clear that the United States would not be able to maintain its position of neutrality. Still, the American public was of mixed opinion. Many resisted the idea of an American intervention and American lives lost, no matter how bad the circumstances. In 1918, artist George Bellows created a series of paintings intended to strengthen public support for the war effort. His paintings depicted German war atrocities in detail, from children run through with bayonets to torturers happily resting while their victims suffered. One image shows Germans unloading sick or disabled labor camp prisoners from a boxcar. These paintings were typical for anti-German propaganda at the time. The U.S. government sponsored much of this propaganda out of concern that many American immigrants sympathized with the Central Powers and would not support the U.S. war effort. In the end, it appears that some of this propaganda paid off. America officially announced its involvement on the sides of the British and French in April 1917, and would eventually send over 2 million American soldiers to join the war effort. Question: why did the U.S. government want to get involved in the war in Europe? What does the lecture imply about the people's support of American involvement in the war? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a world history class. Most scholars agree that the Ice Age played a fundamental role in the rise of agriculture. It was impossible during the much colder and often ice-covered period of the Pleistocene, but inevitable during the Holocene thawing. Only 4,000 years before the origins of agriculture, the planting of anything would have been extremely difficult. Not only were today's fertile farmlands of Spain or the North American Great Plains covered in ice, but also other areas around the world could not depend on constant temperatures or rainfall from year to year. Pleistocene foragers had to be flexible. The warming trend of the Holocene, by contrast, resulted in consistent rainfall amounts and more predictable temperatures. This alteration in habitat could have led to the extinction of megafauna, like mammoths. In the Pleistocene age, humans hunted these large beasts and relied on them for food. Therefore, as animal populations declined, humans were further encouraged to plant and cultivate seeds in newly thawed soil. Question: what encouraged humans to plant and cultivate seeds? Why does the professor mention the Pleistocene period? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a world history class. Confucius lived just prior to the Warring States period. What little we know about his life comes primarily from the Analects, a record of conversations Confucius held with his students compiled after he died. In later centuries, in China, Confucius was revered as a sage, and even today, outside of China, some people might think of him as a strict teacher. However, in the context of his time, Confucius was anything but stiff, and rather a dynamic individual who believed he was mandated by heaven to return the world to a more socially and politically harmonious time. The Analects not only shows a serious and learned man, but also someone capable in archery and horsemanship, who loved music and ritual, and who untiringly traveled the feudal states in the hopes of serving as an aid to various landowners. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? What does the professor imply about Confucius? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a world history class. The Prophet Muhammad started publicly preaching his strict brand of monotheism in the year 613 by reciting the Quran, quickly convincing some of the commoners of Mecca to believe in him. Most of his early converts belonged to groups of people who had failed to achieve any significant social mobility, which, of course, included many of the poor. His followers memorized his recitations and message that called for the powerful to take care of the weak, a message that resonated with many of these economically and socially marginalized. Muhammad's message challenged the Umayyads' clan leadership of society. The most powerful branch of the Quraysh tribe, the Umayyads had been enriching themselves from the lucrative caravan trade, while at the same time ignoring the hardships of the needy. The political implications were clear. The Muslims threatened to disrupt a delicate equilibrium. The Prophet's message jeopardized the social and economic standing of the elite members of society. Question: why does the professor discuss the Umayyad clan? What does the professor mean when she says this? The political implications were clear. The Muslims threatened to disrupt a delicate equilibrium. Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a world history class. Although the 11th century was in many ways Western Europe's lowest point, it would also see the beginnings of Western Europe's re-urbanization. One reason for these beginnings was that in those lands that had been part of the Western Roman Empire, city walls often remained, even if these cities had largely emptied of people. During the chaos and mayhem of the 10th and 11th centuries, people often gathered in walled settlements for protection. Many of these old walled cities thus came to be reoccupied. Another reason for the growth of towns came with a revival of trade in the 11th century. This revival of trade can be traced to several causes. In the first place, Europe's knights, as a warrior aristocracy, had such a strong demand for luxury goods, both locally manufactured products and imported goods such as silks and spices from Asia. Bishops, the great lords of the church, had a similar demand. As such, markets grew up in the areas around castles and churches, and thus caused the formation of towns that served as market centers. Moreover, Viking raids had also led to a greater seaborne trade in the North Sea and Atlantic. Often, Viking-founded markets served as the center of new towns, especially in those lands where the Romans had never established a state and which were not urbanized at all. The Irish city of Dublin, for example, had begun as a Viking trading post. Question: what is the professor's opinion of Western Europe in the 11th century? Why does the professor mention the Irish city of Dublin? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a world history class. When England's King John lost to Philip Augustus, his outraged nobles rebelled, resulting in a civil war from 1215 to 1217. One temporary treaty of this civil war, a treaty known as Magna Carta, would have a much further-reaching impact than anyone who had drafted it could have foreseen. One particular provision of Magna Carta was that if the king wanted to raise new taxes on the people of England, then he needed to get the consent of the community by conveying a council. The conveying of such councils, known as parliaments, would come to be systemized over the course of the 13th century. Parliaments were not unique to England, however. Most Spanish kings would consult with representatives of both Spain's towns and nobility, and the Scandinavian kings had assemblies. England's parliaments, however, would gradually evolve from meetings assembled when a king wanted to raise taxes to a regular assembly that gave representative voice to the people of England. Question: what is the professor mainly discussing? What does the professor imply about the Magna Carta Treaty? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a physics class. Much of what we value in life is fluid. A breath of fresh winter air, the hot blue flame in our gas cooker, the water we drink, swim in, and bathe in, the blood in our veins. So, what exactly is a fluid? Matter most commonly exists as a solid, liquid, or gas. These states are known as the three common phases of matter. Now, solids have a definite shape and a specific volume. Liquids have a definite volume, but their shape changes depending on the container in which they are held. And gases have neither a definite shape nor a specific volume, as their molecules move to fill the container in which they are held. Liquids and gases are considered to be fluids because they yield to shearing forces, whereas solids resist them. A container, for example, is a shearing force, since it forces liquids and gases to change shape based on its dimensions. Solids don't change based on their container. Atoms and solids are in close contact, with forces between them that allow the atoms to vibrate, but not to change positions with neighboring atoms. Thus, a solid resists all types of stress. In contrast, liquids change easily when stressed and do not spring back to their original shape once the force is removed, because the atoms are free to slide about and change neighbors. That is, they flow with the molecules held together by their mutual attraction. Atoms and gases are separated by distances that are large compared with the size of the atoms. The forces between gas atoms are therefore very weak, except when the atoms collide with one another. Gases, thus, not only flow, but they are relatively easy to compress because there is much space and little force between atoms. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? based on the information from the listening, indicate which characteristic on the left belongs to either solid, liquid, or gas. Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a physics class. Pressure is defined as force per unit area. Can pressure be increased in a fluid by pushing directly on the fluid? Yes, but it is much easier if the fluid is enclosed. The heart, for example, increases blood pressure by pushing directly on the blood in an enclosed system. If you try to push on a fluid in an open system, such as a river, the fluid flows away. An enclosed fluid cannot flow away, and so pressure is more easily increased by an applied force. Now, what happens to a pressure in an enclosed fluid? Since atoms in a fluid are free to move about, they transmit the pressure to all parts of the fluid and to the walls of the container. Remarkably, the pressure is transmitted undiminished. This phenomenon is called Pascal's principle because it was first clearly stated by the 17th century French philosopher and scientist Blaise Pascal. A change in pressure applied to an enclosed fluid is transmitted undiminished to all portions of the fluid and to the walls of its container. Pascal's principle is what makes pressure so important to fluids. Since a change in pressure is transmitted undiminished in an enclosed fluid, we often know more about pressure than other physical quantities in fluids. Question: what is the professor's opinion of Pascal's principle? Why does the professor mention the heart? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a physics class. The concept of temperature has evolved from the common concepts of hot and cold. Human perception of what feels hot or cold is a relative one. For example, if you place one hand in hot water and the other in cold water, and then place both hands in tepid water, the tepid water will feel cool to the hand that was in hot water and warm to the one that was in cold water. The scientific definition of temperature is less ambiguous than your senses of hot and cold. Temperature is operationally defined to be what we measure with a thermometer. Two accurate thermometers, one placed in hot water and the other in cold water, will show the hot water to have a higher temperature. If they are then placed in the tepid water, both will give identical readings. Again, just to reiterate, temperature is the quantity measured by a thermometer. Now, any physical property that depends on temperature and whose response to temperature is reproducible can be used as the basis of a thermometer. Because many physical properties depend on temperature, the variety of thermometers is remarkable. For example, volume increases with temperature for most substances. This property is the basis for the common alcohol thermometer, the old mercury thermometer, and the bimetallic strip. Other properties used to measure temperature include electrical resistance and color, and the emission of infrared radiation. Question: why does the professor say this? Again, just to reiterate, temperature is the quantity measured by a thermometer. What is the professor's attitude towards thermometers? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a physics class. Sound can be used as a familiar illustration of waves. Because hearing is one of our most important senses, it is interesting to see how the physical properties of sound correspond to our perceptions of it. Hearing is the perception of sound, just as vision is the perception of visible light. But sound has important applications beyond hearing. Ultrasound, for example, is not heard but can be employed to form medical images and is also used in treatment. The physical phenomenon of sound is defined to be a disturbance of matter that is transmitted from its source outward. Sound is a wave. On the atomic scale, it is a disturbance of atoms that is far more ordered than their thermal motions. In many instances, sound is a periodic wave, and the atoms undergo simple harmonic motion. Question: what is the professor's opinion towards sound? Why does the professor mention ultrasound? Directions. Now listen to part of a talk in a physics class. There are two known hazards of electricity: thermal and shock. A thermal hazard is one where excessive electric power causes undesired thermal effects. A classic example of this is the short circuit. Insulation on wires leading to an appliance has worn through, allowing the two wires to come into contact. This could start a fire in the wall of a house. A shock hazard occurs when electric current passes through a person. Electrical currents through people produce tremendously varied effects. An electrical current can even be used for positive effects, like to block back pain. The possibility of using electrical currents to stimulate muscle action in paralyzed limbs, perhaps allowing paraplegics to walk, is also under study. Still, Many in the general public think of electric current running through the body as both dangerous and potentially fatal. The major factors upon which the effects of electric shock depend are the amount of the current, the path taken by the current, the duration of the current, and the strength of the current. Question: what is the lecture mainly about? Why does the professor say this? A classic example of this is the short circuit. Insulation on wires leading to an appliance has worn through, allowing the two wires to come into contact.
All right, look at you, making it to the end. Congratulations, guys. Good job. No, it wasn't easy. Probably an hour, more than an hour of actually doing this TOEFL listening practice, but you did it. Congrats. Check out tstprep.com. More practice tests, teachers, everything you need for the TOEFL. And please subscribe. It really helps a lot. That's it. Good luck, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.